This is a very impressive turnout. And I think that's partly due to Charlie and Jennifer and Andrea's work too. So thank you to all of you for bringing everyone. Time flies. You know that very well after this experience that you've had here. I hope it's been rewarding, impactful. I know it's been impactful, and that you will carry forward with what you've gained here, and that you'll continue these collaborations, and that this is not the end of anything, but rather part of your professional and personal pathway through life. Welcome back to Taiwan anytime, and please come and see us. To give you a quick update, since I'm sure you're interested, I think all of you have received emails, maybe multiple emails from Hajoe, from me the last few days. The good news is that, Charlie, I think all of our U.S. scholars have signed their grant authorizations. They have been approved. They are coming. Wasn't as easy as it sounds, but they are coming. For the MA students, almost, but because of the delays, 6-week delay in their being notified of their awards, we lost 4 from the Department of Defense. In other words, 4 military grantees. We like those grantees. They're usually very well prepared. We have good partnerships with those military academies, but the Department of Defense wouldn't allow them to delay indefinitely, and they had to make other commitments before we were able to notify them. So we lost those 4 MA students, unfortunately. But the others, I think everyone else, Charlie, am I right, has signed their grant authorization now, and they'll be on their way here. And Charlie and Andrea and Jennifer have a compressed schedule now to arrange those visas and all the other things that need to be done. But we're on track, and they will be here for our September orientation, 5th and 6th, I think it is, right? September 5th and 6th. So, you know, with the cycle of time, we're already planning for the next cohort. You know, we're watching your heels going out the door. But again, you know, we're delighted that you've been here this year. I hope that you think of yourselves as part of the FSE family. And we warmly invite you to visit us again. So I won't delay any longer, and let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeau. And to start today's presentation, I would like to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Linda Shai, to give her presents. Dr. Shai, the time is yours.
Awesome. I can't believe how fast time flies, and now we are making this presentations. It feels like we were just at orientation ourselves, getting to know each other. So my name is Linda Shai. I am an associate professor at Cornell University's Department of City and Regional Planning. I came August 1st, so I've been here quite some time, and I'm really delighted to share the fruits of my year here with all of you. I want to do a special call out to Professor Shumei Huang, who is my host at NTU. I'm super grateful for everything that she helped me with in our collaboration this year. So today I'm going to be talking about the centrality of property rights to climate change adaptation using cases from Taiwan. And this is the tip of Shizidao, which is the confluence of the Keelung and the Danshui rivers here in Taipei. So just as a quick, just as a quick introduction of who I am. Sorry. No. 那我就直接按这个也可以吗？哦，现在可以了。Okay. I was born in Beijing. And I came to the U.S. after June 4th, Tiananmen Square, because the U.S. opened its borders to graduate students, and my parents were graduate students. So I grew up in Cleveland, and then I've traveled all over the world doing research. And so my work tends to be comparative internationally, because that's the basis of how I understand the world, very qualitative cases, and try and make sense of how do they relate to one another, even if they are not directly comparable. And so that is the nature of some of the research that I'll be showing you today. So my overall research questions about my own work concern how climate change adaptation affects in cities affect social justice and ecological repair, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The short answer to that question is that often just because we're adapting to climate change in cities doesn't mean that we do so in ways that are equitable and promoting the well-being of those who are the least well off. And the reasons that we do so aren't necessarily because civil servants are incapable, mean-hearted, or unfair people, but because often our institutions that govern land constrain us from making different choices. And so I'm curious about how we can change those institutions ultimately so that we can make the choices that we all wish we could. Okay, so I was inspired to do some of this work, including during my graduate time. I was in places like Manila, where I saw cities with informal settlement dwellers living along waterways. And after a flood, they would be blamed for the flooding, for living along waterways, for clogging them, and then end up being evicted and removed to faraway places where there are resettlement sites like this. And you can see relative to the skyscrapers, how far they are from the city centers. And so those communities, they are not necessarily safer because there are new hazards that they have to encounter. They certainly are not financially better off because they have no livelihood options. It's harder to make a living, to do lending networks to support each other. So that engenders all sorts of new social and economic problems. And so in this, I began to see that the resilience that we promote in cities often is not an inclusive one. Their resilience is not part of the story that we tell when we're trying to promote cities being more equitable. And so even on the one hand, as we are promoting more resilient cities, we are also getting climate gentrification that also leads to people being moved out of places that are considered resilient. And on the other hand, the places that are slowly being hollowed out, this is in New Orleans on the right, where you're seeing people slowly moving out after disaster, whether they are being relocated or they voluntarily just choose to move on their own. And so there's a slow erosion of communities on the other hand. And so for me, as I look at this pattern of what is causing this, ultimately a lot of this has to do with land, with property, of how we own land, how we relate to land, how we think about who is owning land. And so property and property relations really makes it really structures how we can think about any other overlying institution around land use, around relocation, around social well-being. But as social justice and climate change have become more popular terms that we talk about, I see a lot of people thinking about how do we reallocate resources so that we distribute things so that's fair. I see a lot of people talking about process in terms of how do we include people in participation so that we are building capacity among people so they can participate meaningfully. And almost nobody ever talks about property, which is the most basic rule and foundation for how we allocate who has a right and a stake at the table. So I came to Taiwan this year hoping to learn more about these issues in a context where there are lots of natural hazards, where there's been lots of layers of property rights regimes in an island context with many colonialisms. And I wanted to understand how Taiwan wrestles with these issues in this particular context. I came really not knowing very many people. I will be honest, I applied for the Fulbright very late in the game. I didn't know my host very well. I didn't know really anybody here or very much of what was going on. And so I started out just cold calling professors, meeting different people, and trying to get to know things here. And I think I was generous with myself because Fulbright was generous with me in terms of the amount of time. I didn't just come in and say, okay, I'm going to this site, I'm going to do 10 interviews, and then I'm going to be done. So I said, well, I don't really know people here. Let me talk to some people and see what's going on. Let me improve my Chinese. And so I ended up talking with people. They in turn asked me to give a lot of talks. I gave a press conference that Professor Liao Guixian invited me to give for Shizidao. And through that process, I came to know Taiwan and to know the people who are here a bit better. And so in this process, I also came to know Professor Liao Guixian, who was Melody Stein's Fulbright host, as well as Shumei, who came. And so we ended up doing a lot of collaboration. So I'll just say that in this time, because I came to know them and through others, I traveled quite a lot around Taiwan. I got to see a lot of sites for research up in the north. I also went to Tainan, which I'll talk about later. I got a tour of Qigu, where you see solar panels being built on top of fish farms. I got to see Meinong in Kaohsiung, where there are exciting water detention projects working with farmers to try to retain water before it then rolls downhill to the cities, and to Pintong with Shumei to see indigenous relocation sites. All was not just work, so I'll just say while I'm on this map that we also made use of our time here to see quite a lot of Taiwan for fun and to see the beautiful, exciting, wonderful places in and around the city. All right, so I'm going to talk about, insofar I'm cramming a lot here, I'm going to talk about two projects. There's possibly a third project, but I haven't figured out a thesis for that one yet. So we're just going to talk about two projects today. The first one is called Disaster Risk Reduction by Dispossession, Indigenous and Settler Cases from Taiwan. And it's a collaboration with Guixian and with Shumei. And it's funny because they were PhD roommates at University of Washington back in the day. And so, of course, they've been friends and often thought about collaborating, but they said, your case is so different from my case, I can never see working with you. And then I met both of them and I was like, wow, your cases are so related. Let's write a paper about both of them together. So my main contribution is putting the two of them together because they have been working in their case communities for many, many years. So I'll just give a brief background of how we are understanding this paper through the lens of settler colonialism. So settler colonialism tends to see the world as empty. There's a terra nullius, therefore you can come and it's ready for people to settle. And so there is, of course, a need to control territory because you're going to come and settle it. You have to dispossess the people who already were there. There's a great work by Nichols in 2017 where he talks about property is theft. Theft is property, and talks about how the concept of property was invented so that indigenous peoples could be dispossessed of it. It was a property that was a concept that was created in the process of applying it. And so we're also trying to control local populations and their relationship to land. Now they are dispossessed of it and then reproduce labor within those territories. So as an urban planner, how do we think of planning? Planning oftentimes we think of as a very technical, maybe idealistic. We have a vision of what the ideal city is, but it's also descended from the need to control territories and colonial planning. And so the roots of planning are very much related to the needs to control the local population through the demands of the colonizer, right? So we're not planning necessarily for the people who live there, but for the demands of settler colonists. And then we need to extract and maximize the commodification and the value of that land, and through the control of people. And so there are many ways in which colonialism takes place and how we structure that. Segregation, for instance, is a very common one. How we apply sanitation, how we apply condemnation of places that are seen as unsanitary or informal or substandard. All of those things are part of this particular worldview, but I want to highlight here especially the role of dispossession. That colonialism is a form of structured dispossession of indigenous peoples, and so that is inherent in how we think about planning and colonial planning. It's trying to reduce people's ties to land or to reduce it once the land becomes valuable, and to reclaim it in different ways. It's especially used for dispossession is used in relation to indigenous peoples, but we also see a relationally relevant term like displacement, gentrification, expropriation, even enslavement as a kind of dispossession of your very body are also relevant terms for other types of groups. So the things that we're interested in is in disaster recovery, disaster risk reduction. And so how can we see these dynamics take place, at least in the literature and other places, in terms of settler colonial planning, is that it's not just one event. We can't just understand it as this happens in the flood, but through a long history of things that have been happening that lead to this particular moment. Specifically, it could be that residents can't prove their papers after a disaster. I own this house. Well, where is your property title to this house? Well, I don't have it, right? You could be displaced. It could be that we use a particular standard that says, well, according to this 1 in 100 flood risk, you can't live here anymore. And that's a standard that's used. It might be that we would need to move you to a safer place, but that safer place is defined by some other standard than what you may yourself decide is safe. And then there might be pre-disaster strategies of infrastructure development or urban greening projects or insurance premiums that change, that price you out in different ways. So how does this then apply in the context of Taiwan? And I wish I could move this green and red thing, but I guess I can't. It's okay. So disasters and dispossession. Taiwan is so unique because there have been so many layers of colonization here. And so the colonizer can also be then colonized. And so the definition of who is a colonizer and who is indigenous has been very much evolving on this island. For the early Han who came here, they were then oftentimes themselves colonized by the Japanese. And then the KMT who were coming, they themselves might have felt that they were colonized by the Japanese and they were reclaiming Taiwan as a particular group for themselves and restoring Taiwan to before. And so because of these many layers, we tend not to see the KMT as being defined as a colonizing force. We tend to stop colonization with Japan. We don't see the KMT as doing that, although many of the things that the KMT does really behave in effect like a colonial force. But because politically speaking, it is reuniting Taiwan with the original Republic of China, that legacy is not usually termed. So there is what some people now call settler colonial unconscious. And so there's a small group of scholars, many of them educated or from the United States, who begin to understand Taiwan as a settler colonial society, but are now saying that it's not just enough to say it is settler colonial. We have to see the ways in which it is so. And so our project is trying to do that from the lens of from disaster risk reduction. So our research questions talk about like, what do indigeneity and dispossession mean, given that there have been many waves of colonialism here? How do they manifest in planning for disaster risk? What impact has it had for the communities that are affected? And what are the dynamics and implications now that we're not only just having disaster risk reduction, but also climate change adaptation? So what we do here is we talk about two different cases, and we rely really on Shumei and Guixian's long-term relationships with these communities. In addition, since I've been here, we did a lot of interviews, we did some site visits, both with residents as well as with civil servants. So the two communities here are in a way typologically very opposite communities. One is Shizidao, which is in the capital city. It's a flood-prone site at the confluence of two rivers. It has been settled for as much as 300 years by some of the early Han settlers from Southeast China. And since 1970, it has had a moratorium on development because it is too high risk. You cannot do anything, you cannot change anything, you cannot move anything, don't do anything. And so there's a kind of and now it is being talked about for redevelopment so that you could resettle on site. On the other hand is Pingdong, which is in the southern tip of the country. There are mountainous communities of indigenous peoples, and they have been suffering from landslides and debris flows. And they have been told, it is too dangerous for you to stay. You must leave immediately, and you must move somewhere else. So here are some of the indigenous areas in Typhoon Murago. And Shumei has written about the long history of what has contributed to the vulnerability of these communities before this time, which today, due to the limits of time, I won't talk about. But the 2009 Typhoon Murago dropped like thousands, over 2,000 millimeters of rain over 3 or 4 days. It led to a great deal of devastation, some of the worst impacts in Taiwan as a disaster. And there was a big a recovery process that built on the 1999 earthquake recovery process. And so especially concentrated in Pingtung, where there were the worst impacts, and there was a whole system of relocations of people being moved to these different villages, compressing in some cases many different indigenous communities into one village. And very notably, since we're talking about property and dispossession, in the relocation sites, they have the rights to the house, but not the land. They had to give up the rights to the house and the land in the house in the village where they came from, but they're only getting the rights to the house where they are living. And moreover, they don't have the right to sell the house. They cannot just sell it because you're supposed to stay there. We gifted you this house. You can't just inherit it to anybody. There's a direct line of people you can inherit it to, and you cannot reconstruct and rebuild. You cannot expand necessarily. So there are a lot of constraints on the land rights of the thing that they are getting, even within this particular model. So I'll just give you like one of the most extreme cases here. This is the Paiwan tribe of Couscous, and they lived in a mountain site, which is over here, and it was facing the ocean on the west side of the coast. So it gets a lot of these strong, salty winds. And so after a while, the community recognized, even long ago, they could not live there any longer. So they decided during the Japanese era to move downhill a bit to this particular village site, which during Nomurago partially collapsed or suffered major structural damage. And so unlike most villages which got further moved downhill, they got relocated back to the original site. And so they were gifted these houses that are built with the same design that would have benefited downhill sites, but does not fit the climate in this part. So you can see that it's falling apart now, already 15 years since relocation. But even in this particular site, that was their original village land, they no longer have the right to the land. They only have the right to the house. And so this is, I think, a clear example where you might say from the Han perspective, well, they have such a good deal. No government comes and gives a Han person a house. Like people in Taiwan would love for that, but they're getting a free house. What are they complaining about? But we're not seeing that in the course of many generations that indigenous groups in this area have been dispossessed of vast territories, and now even the very land underneath the house, which used to be their ancestral village. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the Lukai tribe in Changzhibaihe. So here's another then case in Shezidao, which if you want, you can bike all around. It's a very beautiful site, amazing area. And in 1970, this also has its own history, but I'll just start with 1970. The government said, it is too risky. You cannot continue to build here. Let's put a moratorium while we decide what to do with this particular site. And so for 55 years, this community has not been allowed to even renovate their houses, much less build and expand as their families have grown. So you can see here that they have all these sheet pilings on top because it's trying to prevent the houses from deteriorating further. You may not register a business here, so all the businesses that are here are illegal. The government has invested in no roads, in electricity. You will not see electric wires anywhere else in Taipei, but you do see it here because they have not been buried. There are no drains. So it is very much a challenge that is created through government action of what is here. At the same time, it has created multiple layers of levees, 2.4 meters, 4 meters, 6 meters. And when you're in the street level, as you know in Taipei, if you walk around, this is the view of the river that you get. You can actually see the river from most of Taipei. So this is, again, this area has been settled for 300 years. People there talk about how I was here, my family has been here since before the KMT was created, right? And they have 9 different villages that are here. And in the interstitial areas, it is not a site without problems. It's an agricultural site, but as Taipei has deindustrialized, a lot of industries now use this land illegally. And there is a lot of waste dumping, tire recycling, trash, and all sorts of things that is not a nice environment. So rightly, many people there want it to be redeveloped in something that makes better sense. So the government has made many proposals, but this one seems likely to go through. They have proposed to build it this way, which means expropriating the entire 300-hectare site, demolishing everything that's here. leveling up and filling it by another 2 to 3 meters, and then building a new central district on top that would look something like this. And so you can imagine that many people are very opposed to this project, both because of the way that the compensation is designed would actually lead to the displacement of many people who have been there, and also because they have long ties and memories here that they do not want to give up to see it being replaced by something that has so little respect for the history and memory of this particular place. So looking across these two sites, we see that there are this slow erosion of property rights, even if we don't talk about direct dispossession of land. There is the fact that the land rights are not being recognized, the fact that the land relations outside of ownership itself, the other values that we have, are not valued, that the full set of property rights, even within this model, are curtailed or denied in some way, and that, of course, any type of cooperative property, which I have not talked to, but exist in both sites, are also not recognized or permitted. In terms of voice, there's also little voice in people being able to shape how this is determined. And there are examples where, of course, the negotiations exist. In both sites, they are contested, but it is a very, very much a struggle and being pushed for rather than something that is honored and given as of right. So what are the implications for colonial planning? I would say that for me, this means that colonial planning is evident and that it is a useful model for trying to understand how planning is here. We're not trying to say, well, the Han have it better or the indigenous groups have it better, who has it one way or the other, who is more indigenous than the other, but to say that by understanding them in relation to one another, we can see that planning in Taiwan carries still the legacies of colonialism and the mentalities and methods by which planning is done. So if, for instance, indigenous is so celebrated in Taiwan, why do these two indigenous communities have to fight so hard for their ways of life? And so if we use these kinds of understandings, does that help us? I think that's a question we are still grappling with as well. How does using this particular lens then help us understand what it is that we should do instead? If we want to decolonize planning in Taiwan, what is that going to look like? Is it reaching for an indigenous history, whichever version of indigeneity we're talking about, or is it something else? Okay, I'm just gonna take a breather there for a second. We're jumping into paper number 2. Okay, that paper is looking more from the bottom up of 2 community cases, and this case is looking more from the top down to the second paper. And so I'm basing it on a paper that other colleagues in the United States and I have just drafted, and I think it is accepted more or less, of trying to understand how and why property is so difficult, makes it so difficult for us to achieve the kinds of climate adaptation that we want to see. So basically we say, you want to have climate adaptation that is large scale, but it's also systemic, it's socially just, it's environmentally friendly. Why is it that property makes it so hard for us to achieve that vision? One is that property lines are really set. There are lines. That is a thing between you and your neighbor or between you and nature, and we expect that line to stay in place. So it is not a concept that really allows us for nature to migrate. We expect land and water to stay where they are, to stay put and be that way forever. It is also by virtue of having cut land up into small little squares, something that prevents collective action. It's not something that says we are all owners of this thing together. Let's make a decision together, for better or worse, right? Most of us would not really want to make decisions about our building or our home with everybody else together. It's a lot easier to make a decision about it on your own. But because we don't have to make the decision with others, we also don't have the community organizations, the social governance structures that force us to relate to the neighbors around us. So when we have to go and solve a problem that does involve all our neighbors, there's nothing to go to and to reach for. And finally, property rights are fundamentally about extracting value. We create these boundaries and land so that we can commodify it, we can sell it, we can exchange it as resource, and therefore we need it to make as much money as we can, which means that now when we want to return it to nature, we want to make space for water, we want to return lands or other things, we want to create affordable, climate resilient housing, it's really hard for us to do that. So this paper is a collaboration with Professor Andrew Shitran Wang, who just returned from the U.S., having done his PhD and his postdoc there. And he's at Tainan, and he reached out to me having heard about me from a colleague at a conference in the States. And I was looking for people who needed, who knew people, because I don't know anybody. And it's really hard for me to call up a government people and say, can I talk to you? And he was just coming back and said, I need a project. Like, what are the issues here in Taiwan? I need to get up to speed. So we collaborated, and it's a really lovely collaboration. And so we're looking at the major big tools, the tools that I said in my proposal I was going to come here and study, of land readjustment and zonal expropriation, which are big ways of redeveloping land and have been really essential for creating disaster infrastructure here in Taiwan. And we want to understand, how do these things, whether or not do they help us overcome some of the challenges that we see here in terms of property? So I know this is in Chinese. I'll just generally try to explain. Land readjustment is a tool that has been used for hundreds of years, coming through Turkey and Germany, then to Japan, and via Japan to Taiwan. It was used in Japan 100 some years ago after a big fire in terms of restoration and redevelopment. And then they applied it a lot in Taiwan and Korea to test out these tools in the colonies before reapplying it in Japan. And now JICA basically exports this tool to many, many other, especially developing countries. So what this tool does is it says, if I use the tables in this room as an example, look at you, you're a messy set of different properties, but I need to open a big new road and a big new levee. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just either smush you together or say you get some land rights. In the Taiwanese model, what happens is it says, okay, you get this 1 square meter of a table. I'm going to take about half, 30 to 40%, up to half of the land that you currently have. But I'm going to return the other half to you. And you're going to donate half. Now you're like, why would I donate half my land to you? You're going to donate half your land to me because in return, I am going to build roads, infrastructure, water, playgrounds, everything that you need with about 30% of that land. Usually public land is about 30% of the land that you see out there. And then with the 20% of the extra land, I'm going to sell it to a developer. And then with that extra sales, it's going to be what pays for the infrastructure. So rather than a model where I just pay for your whole property, because that requires a lot of money, instead here, I don't have a lot of money. I'm going to make you donate your land. And through that land contribution, you get a higher value land because your land price now jumps 3 times. So it more than compensates potentially for the loss of the half of the land that you gave to me. Is very complicated, but I hope that kind of follows. So in land readjustment, I saw this in a place, I don't have the picture, but it's kind of crazy because when they do this, you go there and there is nothing, hundreds of hectares, and there's just nothing. But there is perfect roads. There are lights. There is a playground. There are signs to the park. There's everything there just waiting then for people to come and build. This is a model that becomes infrastructure first, whereas other places would do something quite different. In theory, it is voluntary because you have to vote to approve it, and at least 50% of you guys have to vote to approve it. But if some of you bought this land and then you cut this table into A4 size pieces of property, now half of you may not be numerically the same as land. At any rate, there's lots of problems one could go into, but that is a general model. Then there's a zonal expropriation model, which is really unique to Taiwan. And in this model, I can take or make you donate 60% of the land, and it's not voluntary. When I decide to expropriate it, that is over. And so that is what they're doing in Shizidao with the community there. So what you can see here in this picture of Taipei is that along the Zilong River, almost all of the sections have had either zonal expropriation or land readjustment alongside. And it is the tool that has helped the city build all of this infrastructure. In Tainan, you can see this land readjustment project. Here is a Tangjiang Ecological National Park, one of the first national ecological coastal parks here. And this site from about 2003 to 2024 got converted from fish ponds into this redevelopment site. And so you might say, wow, that looks like a place that could flood, you know? Maybe we shouldn't build this stuff right there, but they did. And this waterway that you see here is actually not really a river. It's basically like a large detention basin. And it could connect to the rivers on each side, but half the time the river is tidal, so it's higher than this inside drainage situation. So they actually then have to pump it out sometimes in order to make this work. But you could say, well, they accommodated water. It accommodates all the stormwater on this site. It generated a lot of housing. It didn't generate very much affordable housing, but theoretically it could, and it kind of paid for itself. Did it decommodify land? Those of you who know Taipei better than I, or Taiwan prices, will see that these values of land are not at all cheap, right? So I think what we're doing ultimately is to try to understand what kinds of problems do these large-scale redevelopment tools solve? They could help solve some of, say, America's problems of not being able to do redevelopment that avoids gentrification and displacement piecemeal. Theoretically, you could accommodate a lot of people on an area, but just make it denser. Make room for water, make room for affordable housing, and then have a walkable community. That is within the possibility of this tool. But it has to be done in a way that really allows for people to participate and contribute their vision. Otherwise, it really runs the risk of being a new tool for dispossession and displacement and replacing it with high-end development. Okay, so putting these two cases together, or putting these two projects together, I think what I'm trying to overall to say is that there is a colonial legacy that we are seeing here of maximizing productivity, extractivism, planning for somebody other than the local population, and without getting a lot of input and local capacity and knowledge. But that there is in Taiwan hundreds and thousands of years of people who have been living with disasters. It is not a recent phenomenon. And so there is a lot of richness of traditions and knowledge to reach from if we also allow for that in new ways of living with disasters in the future. And so within this model of colonial planning, I think there is still a possibility for learning and change and adaptation without necessarily even aspiring, though we could, of course, but like pragmatically speaking, without aspiring to overthrow the whole system, there are ways of making this a better and more sustainable, more equitable one. So it has been an amazing year here. I don't have 168 Instagram posts like Carmelo has, but you're welcome to see the ones that I have posted. And it has, I think, really changed my life and my family's lives to have experienced what we have here and live somewhere else altogether. And so I'm super grateful to Randall, to all those who read my application and gave me this opportunity last year, to all of the staff who have really gone above and beyond this particular year and have been on this journey with all of you guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sai, for this very detailed, inspiring presentation. So now we have come to the Q&A session. We can take 2 questions. So if you have any questions you would like to raise to Dr. Sai, please feel free.
I'm wondering, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your year experience here in Taiwan, and are there contacts with all of those other places where you have lived and where you have seen similar or parallel issues with land, property, nature, climate?
Yeah, I think the question is maybe the reverse, which is that I see so much commonality. The question for me is what is unique about Taiwan rather than, you know, the Philippines or anywhere else. And so I think partially what makes the Taiwan story very interesting is that it is multi-layered in colonialism. And I think that's true in other places, but is essentialized as being more of a binary. So in the US, when we talk about colonialism, it's really Europeans and indigenous groups, or it's really Black and white relations. But actually, there's many different layers of white, indigenous, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and we don't really think about what does it mean in a colonial context to have the interracial relations among those many other groups without necessarily all relating back to whiteness per se. So I think that the Taiwan story makes that possible, is to think about in this place where these identities are being constantly recontested and redefined, is that an opportunity to change the course so that it does become something different than what we see in other places?
Thank you. You spoke a bit about, well, let me back up. I'm curious what you encountered in terms of a culture of activism in the country, and if there are many groups who are sort of shedding light on this issue. There was a photo from what appeared to be a protest, and just curious if that plays a significant role in sort of policy change in the country, or if it's primarily an active academic or governmental process.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I know China a bit better before this. So for me, coming to Taiwan is like, wow, this is democracy in action. But I think for the Taiwanese, they really see this as democracy in progress. And there are so many critics that I have talked to this year who are deeply unsatisfied with the current degree to which the country is democratic. So there are protests, and it's been interesting to attend some of them and to see how vociferous and virulent and polemical they can be. There was an amazing class that I went to at 政治大学, or organized by a professor who's been a long critic of zonal expropriation. And he has had long-standing relations because he's been helping all of the community self-rescue committees that have emerged in each of these places. And he brought all 9 of them. Like, one had left at 3 a.m. from Pingdong to get to his 9 a.m. class. All 9 of these groups came who protested land expropriation, eminent domain, all of the different varieties that this takes place in. And the stories they told were really heartbreaking. Like, I was crying. People who talked about the cancer that they experienced, somebody who talked about a neighbor who committed suicide the day the electrical company came to cut their power in a way to push them out. People who talked about the people, their family in dementia, even as they were dying, they had the engineering books to try to prove alternative methods of how it could go on. It was so the protests are definitely there, but I think they also look to things like in Japan, where land readjustment is kind of the homeland, has it in Japan, but widespread protests there did lead to real legal changes to how that process is done. And they're still wondering, why don't we see that here? Right. And so you could make the argument that now some people would say, like, indigenous peoples have special rules that protect them, but other people, this kind of land dispossession of 多略 kind of in Chinese, like, is still very present for non-indigenous groups, right? The same way that the state can just expropriate for a particular vision that is not necessarily in the interests of the people who are there. I think that's been really interesting to see. So I was inspired by it. I was really inspired by the professors that I've collaborated with and how deeply embedded they are in kind of activist scholarship. And I think, I don't know, there's not that much activist scholarship in Ithaca itself, but I'll have to find opportunities to reenact that when I go back.
Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Shai. Let's give some. Okay, now it's come to our first and only coffee break. So we have 10 minutes of coffee break. In the meantime, I would like to inform everybody that due to some unforeseen circumstances, our second presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Ching, will not be able to attend today's talk. So we'll have to move Professor Hajoe, Moderegger, and Mr. Devin and Tankersley's presentations a little bit earlier. Thank you for your understanding, and we'll still have Dr. Elizabeth Ching's presenting this year's in our third session of Fulbright Talk on June 17th. Okay, so let's have some breaks. Okay. So everyone, our next presentation will begin in 2 minutes. Okay, everyone, would like you to invite everyone to be seated because our next session for today's talk is going to begin. So we're very pleased to welcome our next presenter, Professor Moderegger, for his video presentation. Yes. So yeah, let's welcome our next presenter.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, video presentation. I hope I timed everything correctly. I went over a couple times before, so I went for this one. I'm Hajoe Moderegger. I am based in New York City at the City College of New York, which is part of CUNY. And I am here, and I hope this goes away, hosted by the Center for Art and Technology at the Taipei National University of the Arts. The title is actually misleading. It should actually rather be a dragon or a snake, which is more common in puppetry. But for me, the idea was to introduce with the title the collegiality and the teamwork that I experienced throughout all the puppeteering, that they're all supporting each other. There's a huge solidarity.
What you are about to see is a special edit made for the occasion of this presentation. It is an amalgamation of 10 months of artistic research and interview and includes the recording of a public rehearsal performance in collaboration with puppeteer Li Yishan, held on May 8th, 2025 at Welcome Lim Kong Society, Taipei.
我自己是因为我们有后场嘛，所以就是我们会有一个那个闹台，就是锣鼓响，就是我自己刚刚锣鼓一响，我们就是在这个就上戏了，你就是要你的精神要投入在戏台当中，你搬戏啊，你得先投入在那个角色当中。有时候你说以前的时候没感觉，因为就是比如后场可能突然，我觉得买台猛才讲，伊刚刚让你去凹顶来起起口口的时候，就是没那么顺的话，你的口白就被他卡住。对啊，很长，因为我们讲3分讲7分后场，其实我们透过很多是透过一些锣鼓点、音乐，对，其实呼吸都是一起的，对啊，对，就是如果因为主演嘛，你要带主演是你除了诠释这些角色之外，今早台湾水来了，你要带着大家，带着文武场，带着二手干嘛的？节奏，对节奏上面有没有在那个节奏上面？
This is silent because it's silent disco, so the music is only transmitted through the headphones.
分配，公交制度是三交代的。现在我临去，这个部门偏偏闯进来，安尼好。
活戏是台湾戏剧的瑰宝，不管是歌仔戏、布袋戏，它的活戏都很厉害。所有现在的演员，像明华园的这个陈胜在老师，他之所以演戏好看，是因为他在演活戏，所以活戏才是在一出戏的这个画龙点睛的东西。那个活戏是今天你在庙口，为什么要演活戏？你演死的剧本，你在剧场可以啊。但是你在庙口，他们不在恭喜发财啊，不然人家卖芭乐的、烤香肠的，台北这个垃圾车又经过，你要怎么让观众愿意留在那边坐着，那边看你的戏，看2个小时？
要跟他们一起。对
啊，你要，就是你的眼神，除了眼神，你要开始抓住每一个观众朋友，就我是在 follow 你，那你在 follow 我。那第二个就是说，我在讲的话是你会想要一直往前。听他在讲什么，然后在一出戏里面什么时候要开花？
开花什么意思？
我们所以活戏的这个美感为啦，就是一些诀窍的话，一开始的还没开演前，我们要叫花，就是叫花，就是有一朵花要开了，大家来看这朵花要开。各位观众朋友，因为布袋非常的精彩，抽刀背剑。一只什么大怪兽要走出来？
电视哦，咱个注目礼个尔，就咱看人啊，咱注目电视。咱咧外口搬，大家咧看较袂清楚，安怎袂清楚啦？人多啊，对，鱼啊，对，当咧看啥嘛拢唔对。所以我爱看电视。 在集中，咱看人在集中，甲好歹你嘛爱看电视才会知影。
Emotions spiral into chaos, desires ignite, nature bends to their call. A heart once clear now shrouds in misty fall as shadows emerge, whispers dark and small.
This was the last part you saw here was a collaboration with Ishen not so long ago in May 8th at a small independent art space, Welcome Lim Kong Society in Taipei. Ishen is also the great-grandson of Li Qianlu. Some of you might know him. I've known him for a very long time already. He's just an amazing puppeteer. These are other professional activities that I've done. I've given artist talks about Lim Kong, TNU, NTU, Hongkong Museum just Saturday. I gave a presentation for high schoolers at the Taipei European School, and I will do a keynote, and I have an upcoming exhibition at Chiayi Art Museum in the fall of 26 with my family. I'm here as my wife and my son, a teenage son, 16-year-old. The art exhibitions, we can't get him to join us anymore, but some of the other cultural adventures, he was taking part in this sulfur fishing, but everything else I did together with my wife. this is Margaret Rung, a former alumni who we met last time he was here. She was invited for a talk at NTU. I also want to thank and express my thanks and list them here to all the amazing puppeteers that I have met and who were so generous with their time and their knowledge and sharing everything, their performances, their thinking. And you have to excuse the translation and I have to look at Cameron specifically here because they're all Google translated. So AI is a huge help in this project so far. So this gives us a way to transcribe, the interviews and get an idea, like a rough idea of the translation. This was my host, the Center for Art and Technology, and which was my host here. This is a beautiful building if you ever go up to Guangzhou. And I also went to thank and express my tremendous thanks to everyone here, Rondell, Charlie, Jennifer, Andrea, Bella, Lisa, and Dahlia. And I probably have met more, but I thought you were just great, and I'm super grateful and thankful for everything that you've done and do. But I also need to mention my wife and my artistic collaborator. We've both been working for 20 years together. And because I get an academic title, sometimes I get attention that she should get as well, but it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
We are now open to questions. So if you want to share anything, please feel free.
Thank you. This was really fascinating to watch. I will admit I didn't follow all of it, but that's my limitations. My question comes out of my own sort of perpetual interest in Taiwanese identity. Can you talk a little bit about which aspects of the puppetry might be specific to Taiwan that wouldn't necessarily be identifiable or practiced in China or among diaspora communities around the world?
Mm-hmm. Specifically, the Zhengguan, the golden ray puppetry, which is, and maybe I can just this part. Oh, what happened? This is the wrong switch here. No, this is not. Might look the same, but what happened here? Oops. Okay, go back. I don't know, you can barely see it, but the neon colored stages, the fireworks, the big puppets, the fire effects, the use of rock music very often, like 60s, 70s music, that's very typical Taiwanese. That started in Taiwan, whereas the other ones, the traditional stages that you saw, the wooden ones, the more traditional looking ones, these were the ones which came from Fujian, which is also, and they're similarly practiced still there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about the interaction between like embodied experiences of art and tools as like extensions of the body? Because I saw a lot here about puppets as like almost like transhumanist, like extension of the body. And I wonder if you could speak on that for a little bit.
That's actually something that we are trying to figure out by comparing puppets to our smartphones, which are both extensions. They're both technologies, but one is a digital and one is the analog technology. But in the way we perceive it, they both have a value that's unique and that's similar. And so if you think of technology as something that has always with us as humans, that defines our progress, I would say. I mean, if you think of the first rock, like human figure or man's figured out like, oh, a rock, I can use it as a tool. Then the tools have grown with us. And so parallel in our development, the tools have developed as well. And so in the development, they embody our knowledge. So the puppets embody knowledge, and the other tools, the handheld tools, embody our knowledge as well. So I don't know if that answers your question or if you want more or.
No, that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I just want to add one thing, just briefly address that as well. The last performance you saw with Ishin was also, so the time here was also not only used to study puppetry, but also to get more familiar with AI and AI tools and AI models and how it works and what it does. And not that I can say, I can speak of the benefits and the not so good things. I'm very questionable of it, but I also have to say that it allowed this to develop in a way that it would not have been possible 2 years ago, because just the way to get like a whole interview of an hour transcribed in like less than 10 minutes on our machine. So for me, it's very important to run everything local, to not outsource it, to try to be aware of the energy resources that are being spent here. But there are obviously many pitfalls, but it allows us to at least get a quick idea in terms of what that is spelled out and have someone else translate it. With the performance with Ishin, we went even further, and it was part of a presentation where we also spoke about the whole evening was about a chapter 50 of the Journey to the West, and it like a different translating AIs gave different translations for it. So we played with that as part of the presentation, but also used that for our playing the script with Ishin. And the song that you heard was actually the Chinese and one of the English translations of the title itself. And then that song was fed into another AI, which can produce songs. You know, you can prompt it and do everything. So yeah, so there's a lot of different, technologies involved here as well. So maybe that's also more embodiment. Yeah.
I would just like to say, I was thinking about things that yours and Linda's presentations had in common. I'll save that for the end because I think there are some interesting ones. But what I just like to say, I was so moved by the film itself. I recalled that you're not a Chinese speaker and not a Taiwanese speaker, but I felt like this was an insider view. It really felt emic rather than etic. It just felt like so sympathetic to Taiwanese identity, the filming, everything you did. I just thought it was beautiful. Really amazing how you've broken that barrier.
Thank you. I mean, that if this was accomplished, I'm very happy because that's exactly how I feel. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now we have come to our third and last presentation of today's Fulbright Talk. Okay. So please welcome Mr. Devin Tankersley for his presentation. Devin.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm not sure how to follow up on such a really interesting and unique presentation. Mine is going to be much more straightforward, kind of academic stuff. I hope that's okay. So I'll be talking about my research from the past 10 months or so, but also giving a little more background on how I came to this point. So the title of my presentation is Not Just North or South, How TSL Signers Are Blending Dialects to Form a New Standard. So I'll give a little bit of introduction and background to Taiwan Sign Language and why that matters to... Oh, okay. And why that matters to my present research questions. Okay. All right, cool. So first, what is Taiwan Sign Language? So it is the national sign language of Taiwan, one of the few countries to have a recognized signed language, which is great. That was signed into law in 2017. There are roughly 30,000 deaf people in Taiwan who use TSL on a daily basis. It's hard to get really concrete numbers on this because there's not a lot of good census data for this. So this is mostly based off of what we know about incidence of deafness and typically how many deaf people in a population will use a signed language. For TSL specifically, it is a member of the Japanese Sign Language family. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means exactly. So old Japanese Sign Language had two documented dialects, one representing the area around Tokyo towards the east, and then another dialect in the area around Kyoto and Osaka towards the west. Now, when the Japanese government had occupied Taiwan, during that time period, two schools were established, one in the south first in Tainan in 1917, and then another one in Taipei in 1919. And so because it was that period of time, a lot of really all of the educators for the deaf at that time were coming from Japan. And so that's why TSL is related to Japanese Sign Language in that way, because at the very beginning, it wasn't TSL, it was JSL. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there were already two separate, very distinct documented dialects of JSL, and they differed in some very basic ways. When teachers were coming from Japan to Taiwan, most of the teachers from Tokyo went to Taipei, up in the north. Teachers who were coming from the Kyoto-Osaka area mostly went to Tainan. And so that original east-west distinction of JSL continued into TSL as a north-south distinction. After World War II, right, the Japanese government left. A lot of Japanese people also left, of course. Many mainlanders came to Taiwan with the new government, and that included some deaf teachers who then set up their own schools to teach their sign language, Chinese Sign Language, specifically their varieties of Chinese Sign Language. From there, a lot of deaf people then were either learning this older form of JSL that was kind of rapidly changing, becoming its own thing in these schools that were set up previously. Then we had students who were learning CSL in their schools, and after they graduate, they have to, talk to each other. So there's a lot of contact that was happening between the JSL that was present initially, which of course was now changing, and then this CSL that was coming in newer. And so modern TSL dialects demonstrate a mix of JSL and CSL signs, along with a lot of local developments. So thinking a little bit about TSL now, as a national language of Taiwan, TSL has been taught in public schools as a Bantu Yuanke or native language class starting around 2022. And so for those who are unfamiliar with this system, all of the national languages of Taiwan are offered as electives to students in public schools. And they get to pick which kind of language they want to have, whether that's Taiwanese, Minanyu, or Hakka, or Aboriginal languages. They get to pick that. So prior to this, TSL had not been taught in public schools to hearing students before. And this meant that there had to be more preparation in terms of getting educational materials, training the teachers, all kinds of stuff had to go into work to make sure that they could actually be taught. Because if a student requested to learn TSL for their Bantu Yuanke, the school had to do their best to provide a teacher. Now, like a lot of these other national languages of Taiwan that I just mentioned, TSL exhibits a high degree of variation. We already talked about these two different dialects, and I'll show you kind of how different they can be. And so it raises some questions about, okay, whose varieties are going to get taught, who's going to be represented in these kinds of situations, and then what does that look like for the future of TSL? So my research right now focuses on what's called lexical variation, which is just basically the idea that people from different backgrounds use different words to refer to the same concepts or the same ideas, right? So for English speakers, a pertinent example might be if we look from the American perspective versus the UK perspective. In the States, we might say a truck, whereas in the UK, they would probably call that same thing a lorry, whereas as American, I would not say that word, even though it does mean the same thing. But those can also happen within, national borders. So within the U.S., right, there's a debate. What do you call that, like fizzy sweet drink? Is that pop or is that soda or is that a third thing, right? So that's what I mean when I say lexical variation. These words have no relationship to each other in terms of how they're pronounced, but they refer to the same kind of object, and they reflect that person's background, whether that might be their national background, their regional background, or some other kind of background. Now, because of its historical development, TSL exhibits a high degree of lexical variation, especially for a lot of basic high-frequency vocabulary. So words like water, name, house, home, these are different in the northern and southern dialects of TSL. So it raises some questions as to, okay, if you use one dialect or another, how do you communicate with somebody who uses very, very different words than you do? And that's another thing I was really interested in. So I wanted to give a quick example of what this lexical variation looks like, kind of breaking down some signs here. So these come from some of the interviews that I recorded, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So these are two signs that both mean roughly the same thing, want or will, like will do something. But they have different associated dialects. So the one on your left refers to, is associated with the Taipei or Northern dialect. And I have a breakdown of how it's produced here. So it has the hand shape that you see there. It has contact close to the neck or the throat, has a particular movement pattern. And we can contrast that with the one in the south, which has a rather different production, right? For one thing, it's two-handed, it's not one-handed. It uses different hand shapes. The location is quite different. One thing that is similar about the same, these two signs is that the non-manual markers, that is to say, in this case, the facial expressions, both have these puffed cheeks like that, which can also stand on its own. So it kind of helps to bridge a little bit of that gap of, okay, maybe we sign these differently with our hands, but we can produce the same mouth sort of feature, and that also can maybe bridge a little bit of that communication gap. Okay. And, this is not just one singular sign. If you get a bunch of these signs together, you can very quickly get sentences or phrases that look quite different from each other. And just a quick example of this, I came up with a few different sentences, but for time, I just picked my favorite one. So this is a somewhat contrived sentence, but also based off of some conversations that I did have during my research with various deaf people in Taiwan. So I'll show you how this sentence is produced in Taipei signing, and then in Tainan signing or Southern signing. So first on your left, the Taipei version. Okay. And this means like I don't like lard, I don't like pork oil, pig oil. And then the Tainan version. Okay. So that's kind of fast. I wanted to have a quick breakdown of what these look like one by one, so you can kind of see how different each sign really is from each other. So first the signs for pig. The northern one seems to profile the tusks of like a wild boar coming out of the mouth like this, right? Whereas the southern one seems to profile like, I think of like the snout on a pig, like eating or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but that's how I view it. The signs for oil, right, again, look very different from each other. I don't know the iconic basis for the sign for oil in the north, but for the Tainan sign, I think of like spreading butter, and then butter is oily, and then that kind of gets extended to butter more generally. And then the signs for not like, on first glance look kind of similar, but they do have very different starting points, different hand shapes. And I also wanted to point out one thing about this sign on the bottom right corner here, which is that it is homophonous with a northern sign, which means to not want. So in some context, like the example that I gave there of I don't like or I don't want pig oil, lard, in context, it might not matter that much if I say I don't like it or I don't want it. But in interviewing lots of people, they comment on how this homophony, where these look very similar, can cause some confusion, some disagreement about what is someone actually saying. And so this is a relevant fact for a lot of signers in Taiwan, that even though maybe we could probably get it from context, they still feel like, hey, no, these should be different concepts. These are different ways to sign them. So my research questions, I have 3 here, but for today's presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on the first 2, which is that, so we know that there are these documented traditional dialects of TSL, these northern versus southern dialects, but it's been a long time, over 100 years since the first schools for the deaf were established in Taiwan. Is this still the best way that we can understand variation in TSL through this northern-southern difference? Or are there other ways that we can understand variation in TSL? Is there more than just north and south? Is it more of an age thing? What ways can we look at variation in TSL? Second question that I had was, how do TSL signers navigate this? When there's so many very basic words that are produced very differently from each other, how do you overcome misunderstandings or any kind of difference in communication, right? So when I did my interviews, I wanted to see what people said about how they deal with this kind of problem. So, like I said, over the past year or so, I've been doing this research, but I've also been doing all I can to stay engaged with the community, and I just wanted to highlight a couple little things that I did. So whenever there was some local gathering of local of deaf and hearing people, whether that was just to chat, have conversations, or it was a little bit more of like learning something, like teaching people how to sign. I tried to go to those kinds of events whenever I could. If I was invited to some kind of local outing, like a hike or any kind of big event, I tried to do that, attending, tour guides, that type of thing, people explaining different parts about Taiwan. I was interviewed twice about my research, once by the Longsuwan team, which is associated with the National Association for the Deaf here in Taiwan. They're both on YouTube, and so if you want to watch them, you can. And then also once for a segment by the 公视手语新闻, so the public television service, sign language news. And then you can see the little clip there as well. And also with the support of the Taiwan Athletic Association for the Deaf, I held a workshop on my research on lexical variation in TSL. So my whole presentation was presented in TSL for a largely deaf audience. Okay. So moving on to the research that I did over the past year or so. Here's a quick example of what some of that might look like. So over the past 10 months, I did fieldwork in 6 different places in Taiwan, trying to get a balance of not just north and south, but also central regions of Taiwan. I picked 2 for each parts. So 2 places in the north, Taipei and Taoyuan, 2 in the central part of Taiwan, Taichung and Yunlin, and then 2 in the south, Tainan and Kaohsiung. All of these places were picked for their pretty active deaf communities, pretty large deaf populations. And Taipei, Taichung, and Tainan specifically also have schools for the deaf. The Taichung school started much later. I believe it was founded in the 50s, I want to say, but I'm really bad with dates, so I apologize. But yes, the schools being kind of hubs for the community was really important. So I wanted to, of course, go to those places as well. But other parts of Taiwan also have large deaf communities, especially larger cities like Kaohsiung. So I conducted 2 types of interviews with each participant. I did one-on-one word elicitation tasks where I ask, what's their sign for a particular concept, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then I also wanted to collect more naturalistic data from the participants because the one-on-one task can be very dry and it's just me and them, and so they might be changing how they sign to accommodate to me as a double outsider. I'm not Taiwanese, I'm not deaf. So I wanted to make sure that I had documented also more naturalistic conversation between community members. So I asked for the participants to come together for an hour to have a conversation with each other, and I led some of that discussion, trying to encourage them to have naturalistic conversations with each other. So each session took about 1 hour each. Participants were paid 300 NTD for each hour of their time. And then also during this whole year, I did as best as I could to write lots of field notes. It's hard to write them in the moment because I have to be looking at the person, signing in front of me. So I couldn't that wasn't going to work. So, whenever I would finish going to some event or I would go meet some people, I would, take notes about what I noticed, about what people saying so that I can contextualize their responses throughout the interviews. So here's a quick example of what one of the word elicitation tasks looks like. So these one-on-one interviews, I asked them for their preferred signs for a total of 97 words or concepts. I started out with more, but it was really hard to get a lot of concepts in 1 hour, especially when some people were very talkative. Each word was presented on an iPad in written Mandarin with an accompanying image. So you can see an example like that there. And it says, how do you sign borrow? And the image there represents the concept of borrowing. What surprised me was, especially even in my very first field visit, I didn't just get one response for a lot of the signs. I thought it was going to be, yep, this is my sign, done. But a lot of people gave me multiple signs. And so then the question became, okay, which one is the one they use the most? Which one is their sort of preferred sign? So if they said, this sign, this sign, this sign, this sign, A, B, and C, I would ask some follow-up questions like, do these signs have the same meaning for you? Is there some kind of difference in how you use them? And then if they could give me, some of that information, that helps. But I also might ask like just a very simple, which one do you use more? And that's how I based it off of, okay, that's their preferred sign if that's the one that they use the most. For the sociolinguistic interviews, like I said, the participants were paired together, and I tried to act as a facilitator or interviewer. So I had a list of questions that I would go through to ask them, and some parts were elaborated on or skipped depending on how much how interested the participants were in those particular topics. If they wanted to talk more about it, great. Go for it. If they didn't really care, okay, I've got plenty more questions that we can go through. That being said, I tried to make sure that each session included some very basic information about each participant, so their backgrounds, especially how and where they began acquiring TSL. And I also wanted to know a little bit about their involvement in the community, right? Because part of this is, how do we navigate variation? How do we deal with people who communicate differently from us? And so part of that is knowing, okay, do you do that a lot, or do you end up just kind of staying with your own little bubble and you don't have to necessarily overcome those communication gaps? So I asked about their engagement in local events and how they handle communicating with the people who sign very differently from them. So here's a quick overview of the data that I collected. I interviewed a total of 74 participants across the 6 regions that I had visited. My goal was to get at least 10 per area, and I was able to get a bit over that for all of them, some a little bit more than others. I collected about 101 hours of data with more elicitation hours than the interviews, of course. And it's a lot of data to go through. I have not been able to really dig deep and annotate all of the data just yet, but for the sake of this presentation, I wanted to make sure that I had a balance of all the areas that I went to. So I picked more or less at random 6 participants just to be kind of representative. So this is more of a kind of first glance at where my research is going with this. And so some parts of it might change when I get to later phases, but I think this gives us a first kind of quick idea of what the distribution of these signs will look like. Okay. So my main thesis that I'm going to try and present and argue for here is that there is a blending of North and South dialects, these 2 kind of traditionally associated dialects that's happening across Taiwan. And I want to give you guys some examples of what that looks like and kind of what sort of direction I think this is going to go. So one thing about TSL is that the northern dialect being associated with Taipei has a bit more prestige in that there are more resources for people in Taipei. So, for example, the National Association for the Deaf, which is based in Taipei, might have more access to funding, to do events, to make videos that get posted to YouTube. The sign language broadcast, the the news program that I mentioned earlier, has usually more like northern signers. So there's more prestige associated with Taipei. Given that, I expected that northern signs would kind of become dominant across Taiwan because that's how we generally expect language contact situations to work. If one is more prestigious, that tends to be the one that people want to emulate more often. Now, while this is true for some of the signs that I investigated, I was really surprised that a lot of Southern signs, certain ones in particular, were becoming more dominant across Taiwan, and that certain Northern signs were becoming less common across Taiwan. And so to kind of show you what I'm talking about a little bit, I have a case study of 2 signs here. One sign for hui, meaning like to be able to do something, and then the signs that we saw earlier for want, yao. So starting with hui, here are the 2 kind of traditional northern and southern signs, the one on the left being the traditional northern sign, maybe the 2 hands going. And then on the right, the traditional Tainan sign, southern sign, which is one-handed and goes up like this, right? And so the dots here represent the participants who said that they either preferred the sign or that they knew the sign. And you can see an honestly pretty even distribution. All the areas that I went to at least knew both on some level, and they may have generally preferred one over the other. So this map is a little bit unclear in terms of, okay, which one is more dominant or more frequent. So I also made a quick bar graph that kind of helps to show. So the blue bars represent the parts of the participants who said this was their preferred sign, and the green ones represent when they told me they knew the other sign, but maybe they didn't like it, they didn't prefer it, but at least they recognized it. And we can see just a quick glance at this that the Taipei sign, the 2-handed sign, is much more dominant in a lot of these places than the one-handed sign. And again, given what we said about Taipei prestige, this kind of makes a certain degree of sense. Or at least this is what I expected to see, I should say. In contrast with the signs for want, we can see that, again, we have a somewhat similar distribution between the two parts. We see some in the north, some in the central, some in the south. But with the traditional Taipei sign, nobody used that in Yunlin, from what I remember. So we can already start to see there's quite a big difference with the northern sign not showing up as much. In contrast, the southern sign showed up in all the places that I went to. And again, breaking it down with our bar charts here, we can see that the southern sign, the two-handed sign, is represented in all of these areas pretty strongly, whereas the one-handed sign only kind of represented in some places, a little bit stronger in Taipei for sure, but the Yunlin data that I have annotated so far, nobody used it. So that tells me that this sign is very much not dominant in comparison to the other one. So in addition to this kind of melding of the two dialects where, it's not just one sign or one variety becoming more popular, but some signs from one variety getting popular, some signs from the other getting popular. What I also was really interested and did not expect was what seems to be a kind of blending, like using parts of both types of signs together at the same time for some signs. And so I had through here, but for time, I'm only going to talk about one, which is the sign for Sunday that I saw from a few people. So here are the two Taipei and Tainan signs respectively. So the Taipei sign is one-handed, right here. This means Sunday. The one on the left, or sorry, your right, is the Tainan one, two-handed. It's got these two hand shapes, right? These hand shapes represent the number 7, and so the idea is the 7th day of the week, which is made up of 7 days, similar to how in Mandarin we might say 星期一, 星期二, 星期三, except we don't say 星期七, but that's the idea, is that it's weekday number 7. So that's where that comes from. What I saw, not a lot of people, but a few, would sign something like this. So this one participant used the Taipei sign on his right hand, and then on his left hand used the that's part of the Tainan sign. And yeah, this was a very interesting blend that I was not expecting to see, and I hadn't found documented before. And it's interesting to me about why that might be the case, and that's part of what I want to dig into more, is why we're seeing some of these blended variants in the way that we are. The other thing that I noticed was a number of people who said that they not just recognize, okay, there are these northern signs, these southern signs, but that I do use them both, but kind of in different ways for different purposes. And I expected that, okay, if you do know both, maybe if you're talking to someone from Taipei, you'll kind of use more Taipei signing. If you're talking to someone from Tainan, you'll use Tainan signing. That makes sense. What I was not suspecting so much was these kind of differences, these sort of gradient differences that they would make while talking ostensibly to the same people, but having some kind of meaningful difference between when they use one version or the other. So again, I had 3 different examples I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to focus on the one for pig here today. So again, we had those 2 signs for pig that I showed you earlier, but this is coming from one of my participants. So the comments that I have here were her comments about these signs, how she used them. For a little bit of extra background, this particular participant is from Taichung. And Taichung is interesting in that one of the teachers who went to establish the school there in Taichung, they mostly came from Tainan. And so it had that traditional Tainan signing, and that's still largely maintained today. But being in the central part of Taiwan, all of the mobility that's happening now in Taiwan, there's a lot more contact, right? And so people from Taichung, I found, had some blends that I found really interesting. So in particular, this participant said that the Taipei sign she learned later in life, maybe after school, after graduating from school, but now she uses this sign kind of as the general term for like the pig, the animal or the meat, right? She was taught the Tainan sign on your right as a child when going to school, but now uses it mostly as a kind of insult, like, oh, you're such a pig, you're lazy, you're stupid, you're slow, etc., that kind of thing. So maintaining both types of signs, but making some kind of distinction between them and how they're used or what they mean exactly. Okay. I want to close a little bit on talking about attitudes around variation and why I think we're going to start to see more of this blending of the dialects moving forward. So while I tried not to be super direct about like, hey, what do you think about this whole, Tainan, Taipei signing difference thing? I tried to elicit some idea of, okay, what happens when you have different ways of signing? How do is it easy for you? Is it hard for you? All that kind of stuff. And even without necessarily prompting it, a lot of people would tell me it is hard or impossible to standardize TSL. It's hard for everyone here to sign the same, right? And for some people, that might be a way of saying, okay, well, we need to come up with something new. But instead, what I found was a lot of people said, nope, that's your sign. That's fine. You can sign that way. And sort of implicitly encouraging an understanding of those signs, even if you don't yourself prefer to use them, right? Early on in the year, I attended a sort of workshop, a presentation from an association that works on researching TSL. And so it was break time, lunchtime, just kind of talking about this random stuff. And one person was talking about, I don't know, maybe the sign for green or something like that being, oh, that's a Tainan sign or something like that. And I saw one deaf person tell another deaf person to basically stop making these distinctions between northern and southern signing, right? That it creates these kind of divisions between the community across Taiwan, and maybe sort of advocating for a more kind of unified idea of what it means to use TSL in Taiwan. And also, I thought really interestingly, adding that we don't always know for sure what is going to be a northern sign or a southern sign. We do have some documentation, but it's really hard to go back in time and see what was signed back then. Unless there were some pictures or at least some kind of written description, we don't always know really what was being signed back then. And so it's not just saying, hey, we don't necessarily know what's a northern sign or a southern sign without looking at the documentation, but it's not really helpful to us now to make these kinds of distinctions. And of course, that is just one person's attitude, but it's interesting to me to see how for some people there is this push for a kind of more unified idea of what it means to sign TSL, and combining that with this idea of, well, we can't really standardize it, but we can recognize what other people are going to sign. Tells me a little bit about where TSL might go in the future. So what I found so far is that lexical variation looks to be alive and well in TSL. I would say that on a lot of fronts, we still get a lot of lexical variation. I've only really showed you a few examples, but there's a ton of stuff that I was very much surprised by. Local innovations, new things that were happening that hadn't been documented before, not just these kind of blends, but brand new signs that, as far as I know, nobody had seen previously, or at least nobody had documented in sort of academic circles. That being said, there are a lot of social pressures that are going to force people, or at least encourage people, nudge people to start changing how they sign. That could be related to the educational system that I mentioned earlier, where, okay, now there are resources getting put towards making TSL. Perhaps over time, whatever is printed in those resources will become the basis for at least what deaf people have to know, because that's what's being taught to hearing people. Also, more movement between deaf people. Maybe they grew up in one part of Taiwan, but then they go to another part of Taiwan for work. It's a very common background for a lot of my participants. So it's hard to say like, oh, you're a pure, Taipei signer, when maybe they grew up in Tainan, they went to school in Tainan, and then lived for 20 years in Taipei, right? But that's how life is. Nobody's going to be a pure signer or a speaker of one type of variety, right? And so what I think that we're going to start to seeing is a kind of convergence towards a variety of TSL, which blends these kind of traditional Taipei and Tainan signings, as well as other parts of signs that exist in TSL. And this could be through things like the phonological blending, like we saw for Sunday. This could be through things like creating these novel distinctions that didn't exist before. Maybe we just had like a general term, but now we're kind of using that general idea, but breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts, and using signs that have no formal relationship to each other, but now kind of have this extra connotation or meaning to them. And we might see a sort of coalescing on signs that don't have a particular dialectal association, at least in TSL. So I didn't show you here, but there are three documented signs for water. The Taipei one looking like this, as if you're kind of shaking water off your hand. The Tainan one looking like this, which could be from like washing one's face, or alternatively like drinking water, and then it just kind of got simplified over time. But the one that I saw more and more, especially among younger people, though not exclusively, was this sign, which is related to the kind of like older written character for water in Chinese, like not like the modern day one where it's like this, but the kind of like one. So that. And that one is becoming quite popular. So we might see that in some cases, instead of trying to use these dialectal signs, we're going to use something else so that, okay, I know you know it because it's not just Tainan or Taipei. Okay, so to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about the future applications that I have for this data. So I am a PhD candidate at the University of New Mexico. My goal is to write my dissertation over the next academic year and graduate by that year, and then hopefully have a job where I can continue to do this research. Once that is taken care of and I have a place to do this kind of research and continue with it, I want to use the data that I have to create a website and probably also an app to show lexical variation in TSL. I'm hoping to make it useful for learners of TSL, for teachers of TSL, especially those who might not be represented in textbooks, like their own way of signing might not be represented in textbooks, but this is a way of sort of demonstrating, no, this is a valid way to sign this in your region of Taiwan. And so you can use this and show this to your students. And then also to give more sort of information to people who are designing these materials. So they can say, oh, okay, this is like the Taipei version, this is the Taichung version, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, I'm hoping to make it useful to researchers of TSL by including some other kind of more complicated, more detailed information that your average layperson doesn't really need to know, but people who are big nerds about this like me want to have like a lot of raw data, and so to provide that to other researchers as well is a goal of mine. Here's just kind of an idea of what I would love to be able to do in the future. So this is a database on Japanese Sign Language, where they have been working on collecting data from different parts of Japan, getting, I think I want to say at least 10 participants in each place, like with different age cohorts, and comparing their lexical variation, comparing how they talk about various different things. And I would love to be able to do something like that in Taiwan. And so to wrap up, I would like to say thank you to the various people who have made this possible. First and foremost, of course, is Fulbright Taiwan. I wouldn't be able to be here doing this research without your support. It's made this possible from the very beginning. I'd also like to thank the deaf associations in the areas that I visited for their support in helping me find participants and offering me spaces to collect that data so that I wasn't having to pay to rent a lot of spaces. Right. And so these are the places that I went to and I worked with. I'd also like to thank Professors Jane Tsai and James Dai of National Zhongli University for their support and feedback throughout this whole year. I'd also like to thank all the participants who signed up for my research. Again, I couldn't have done this without them. And then just more broadly, I'd like to thank the deaf community for allowing me to learn about their signed languages in general and supporting me in their academic endeavors, and my academic endeavors, excuse me. And I hope to be able to support them in their goals more in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Devin. Now let's move into our, okay, Cameron.
I just want to thank you for such a fascinating presentation. As someone who works on Fangyan and media, I'm really interested in these questions of regional variation. And one thing I hear again and again is specifically related to Gongshi Xinwen, specifically their Taiyu broadcasts. Nobody is happy with it because of these questions of they feel like it's an amalgam of too many regional variations and it creates a lot of angst. And I'm curious because your research was very much focused on a lot about it seemed to interact with other signers, but I'm curious if they had any thoughts about broadcasts, especially since you mentioned Gongshi earlier in your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Right, that wasn't a question that I specifically sought to answer with any of this, so I didn't bring up that one. And occasionally when I talk about when I did these interviews with the participants, they would on their own bring up, for example, things like news or things like social media. Social media, I think, was a more dominant sort of factor in like what's going to be popular, at least according to what they were telling me. That being said, I've maintained kind of a long-term relationship with one TSL teacher in particular, and occasionally we'll talk about the Shoyu one. And what she has told me a number of times is that people just don't watch it. So I don't know how big of an impact is. I think it's probably a little bit similar to what you're describing of like, there are a lot of people who just don't really care for it, aren't really happy with it for one reason or another, whether that's because they feel like it's very sort of northern signing, whether that's because maybe it's hard to kind of parse in some ways, like the way that they sign can be hard to sometimes parse. I've heard people complain about like for the way that they introduce the segments is they have a host introduce a segment in TSL with Chinese captions and also Chinese voiceover, and then it cuts to like the TV clips, right? And then you have the voiceover, but no signing for that part. So it's only this kind of introductory section that's actually in TSL. The rest of it is in spoken and written Mandarin with the captions. And one complaint was something like the captions that they give for that host part don't really match up well. Like it's too formal, or it's maybe in different order or something like that. So I think a lot of deaf people don't really watch it that much. So I don't know how big of an impact it really has, but I think it does lend a certain level of prestige to type A signing. That's what I could say.
Thank you so much. Such a cool project. I'm so impressed that you not only speak multiple languages, but also then sign multiple languages here is super impressive. I have two questions, if that's allowed. One is I'm wondering whether there is a push now that it's a public language that's taught for a national curriculum that does set a uniform one. I would suspect that's the case because like in my kids' school, they had points taken off because she did it 6 times 9 when obviously the correct way to write it is 9 times 6. So uniformity is like a real thing. And in doing that, how does that change some of the diversity you're talking about? And then I have a question that may be a bit outside the scope of your research, but I am curious that in some ways I wonder how the different dialects in sign language is different than or similar to the different dialects in spoken language, and even the ability to read both simplified and traditional Chinese at the same time. And so does kind of like maintaining both and allowing for that variation tell us something about people's identities that is similar or different? Like I'm also curious, in China, do they have a single uniform Chinese sign language? And how does an attitude toward that, given all the variation across that very large country, compared to Taiwan's approach to the same issues?
Yeah, thank you. So the first part was about sort of education system and sort of whether that's like a actual sort of standard that's being pushed and then sort of or a more de facto kind of thing, what the effect that is going to have. So I wanted to dig a little bit into the curriculum that exists for TSL, and there is kind of like a standardized curriculum that's used across all the public schools in Taiwan. And I wanted to look a little bit at some of like their textbooks. I haven't done a super deep dive into that just yet. I did kind of look a little bit at some of them, and what I found was that they would sometimes include both, like for example, like a northern and southern variation. Depends a little bit on what the book is. Whether or not they might actually say this is northern and southern, they might just say like A and B, and maybe it's up to the teacher, up to the student to decide what that means or how to use it. As far as how that like might impact something like their grades, like if they get taken points off, I think it would probably be a separate project to look at like how teachers deal with this kind of on a day-to-day basis. Informally, I would say that a lot of, especially like the deaf teachers, are kind of like, if it's comprehensible, okay, like it's better than nothing, so I don't know that it's going to make such a kind of direct impact in the way of like, oh, you got a B when you could have gotten an A or something like that, or I don't know that it's going to have that effect, but I think what's getting documented, what's getting put in these books will get spread, but that may not reflect kind of the variety that exists already in other places. And the part about identity. So I think this is still a very tricky kind of thing to grasp exactly what's going on with identity there. I do think there is something, and I was really fascinated by that comment of, stop distinguishing between North and South, right? This idea that it's all TSL, it's just this person's kind of TSL, and that's fine. They can sign that way. I understand them and whatever. But you also have people who don't feel that way, who feel, there should be one way to sign this, or, okay, well, that's the type A sign and that's your sign, but like, no, this is Tainan, we're going to use this one. They don't always have historically kind of accurate ideas of that. They just sort of going on vibes a little bit. So I do think there is a connection there of kind of constructing this more unified kind of Taiwanese identity, but also still being able to reckon with, well, okay, yeah, I'm Taiwanese, but I'm from Tainan, or I'm from this other place. And I think maybe the people who are more involved with TSL research and education have a little bit more of this broader perspective, because they have to communicate with so many different people. They have to go up and down Taiwan. But if you're on that kind of more local level, this is just my signing. And you're not necessarily thinking about that bigger picture. At least that's what I would say. As for Chinese Sign Language, it's not my area, so I don't know too much about it. I do know that there are different dialects of CSL, and that there was a push, I want to say in the 70s, for a kind of standardized CSL, also similar for Taiwan. And it was based heavily on written Chinese, in the sense of following, Chinese word order, having one sign for every single character, that kind of thing, and trying to do it like, character by character. And there was a similar effort in the Ministry of Education here in Taiwan that has had a lasting impact, but it hasn't like completely overtaken TSL. I can't speak too much more about that for CSL. I don't know too much, but I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. I really fascinating talk. I'm glad to be able to learn a little bit about a subject I knew nothing about. Certainly prior to meeting you last fall and then today. But so quick question. Do you have a sense of how much of the difference between the dialectal variation has to do with the earlier distinction between Eastern and Western Japanese, or JSL, and also perhaps to a differential impact of post-war CSL? My sense of other areas of Taiwanese culture after 1945, and how they were influenced by the arrival of the mainland, is that impact was greater in the North, linguistic, spoken language, religious culture, food. So those are my questions.
Yeah, so one avenue of research that I wanted to pursue with this project, but very quickly realized I don't have time to make that happen, was to kind of figure out some of these more historical relationships. So like, okay, is Taipei signing more, or still look a lot like Tokyo signing, that kind of thing. I wanted to look into that, and I still want to in the future, but I don't have a good answer to that just yet. I would say that parts of it are definitely there, some of the parts that I've looked at, but I can't give you like a number. But I would say that there's those connections are still relevant today. As for the kind of influence later on after World War II of CSL, again, anecdotally, I would say that there was a stronger influence of CSL on Northern Taipei signing in a lot of different ways. But what is kind of confounding for me is while there was a school for the deaf established by a Chinese deaf man in, I want to say Jidong, so that effect may have happened sort of in the north and kind of spread from there. There was also one in Kaohsiung, and I have met people who went to that school back at that time, and why that seems to have had less of an impact in the South is unclear to me. They remember a lot of the signs from back then, but like, oh no, that was back then. That's when I signed that, back then. So I can't tell you right now maybe why that was the case. If it is related to some of more of these political identities, that could be a factor. But that's just me speculating at this point. Yeah.
I really wish that you were 1,000-year-old elf, so you could do this every 100 years, because your sociolinguistic has a historical element that it would be fascinating to see how it changes. That was just a comment. I'm really curious about when you were interviewing people as you were traveling through the island, when do people stop saying I speak Northern TSL and I start speaking Southern TSL?
Yeah, I would say for a lot of people, it's not quite so direct of like, oh, I'm a Northern signer, I'm a Southern signer, especially if you are not somebody who does have contact with, lots of people from across Taiwan. Some of those distinctions may not seem relevant. It's just like, this is how I sign. This is how I sign with my friends and my family. If you have gone to a school for the deaf, you do get a little more of that identity of like, oh, this is the type I sign and I prefer it. Usually not quite so direct of I prefer it because it's a type A sign, but like this is a sign I used growing up. I still want to use it. I would say Taichung is kind of an interesting case because being in the center, right, that you would think maybe that's where you start to see some of this happening. To a certain extent, you do. But I also feel that Taichung is kind of getting its own identity, which I didn't really talk too much about here. But there are certain signs that seem to be specific to Taichung that I haven't seen elsewhere. So, especially once there is a school for the deaf, it does kind of create this locus for local identity, local community. And so the fact that there is a school there tells me, okay, something else is kind of happening. As far as like, okay, people are calling themselves Northern or Southern signers. I don't know that there is a clear like line, but people have a good sense of like, this is what I used growing up. I went to school in Tainan. These are Tainan signs. With some exceptions, they have pretty good intuitions about that. And they will often align their preferences with what they learned in school. But again, not interestingly, not always. And it's looking at where that pattern doesn't work is what's really interesting to me. Yeah.
Hello. Right. I was pretty interested in how you, at least one of these slides, that you broke it down by age. So I have two questions, if that's okay. So like first, from like what you observed, do you think that like the age of the TSL user kind of like determined just like the vocabulary, like how many different signs they knew, the preference for those signs, and also too like for younger like younger users of TSL, I'm kind of interested like uh from what I understood in like schools, it's mostly hearing students that are learning it. And so for younger like deaf users of TSL and like the hearing students now, like is there a complete separation between those communities and how is like the linguistic and like the vocabulary flowing between those? If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for those questions because it's stuff that I want to get into a little bit more, especially the age part, but I haven't had a chance to kind of really dig into that analytically. Coming from kind of sort of general view, holistic, anecdotal sort of view, my initial thought was maybe younger signers have fewer variants. Like, older signers will have both maybe Northern and Southern, and maybe younger signers will have maybe some blend, or they'll just pick one. And while I think that could be true in some cases, that might just be chalked up to language experience. If you have lived longer, you have probably interacted with more people, you've probably seen more signs. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that like, oh, younger people are picking one and sticking to it. It might just be they haven't had as much linguistic experience to kind of know all these different variants. So I would say that there are some things that seem to be more indicative of younger signers. And this could be because of the way that deaf education tends to work, where educational policies play a big role in what's getting taught, whether that's more, naturalistic kind of signing, more signing that's based off of the written language, or oralism, like no signing at all, you have to speak now, right? And kind of leading into or coming into that part of it with the younger people. So my the ages of my participants skewed relatively older because it was very hard to find younger people who were fluent signers and also just willing to be recorded. They were a lot of times very, very shy. So it was hard to get those kind of participants, especially the very younger ones. But what I have been told a lot is many young people are just not learning TSL very much. I visited two schools during this time. I didn't mention it here, but I visited the Tainan School for the Deaf, the middle school and high school parts of it, and got to kind of do a quick sort of observation. And there's not a lot of signing in there. So I think a lot of deaf kids are not being exposed to very rich TSL. It's mostly hearing teachers who are doing a lot of like speaking and also kind of signing at the same time. So there is definitely a gap between now who's getting access to TSL. And while that's not something that is part of my project now, in the future, you know, when I'm in a position to do more advocacy, it's something that I want to be able to push for is, okay, we have these hearing kids who can, you know, take TSL classes, but a lot of deaf kids don't have that option, you know, for whatever reason. So I think there is a gap in kind of how these, how TSL is getting used by these two groups, but it's not like specifically an age thing, if that makes sense. It has to do more with these kind of power dynamics and what's being done in the education system for deaf students.
Thank you very much. That was our last question. Thank you very much, Devin. Now we have come to the end of today's event. We would like to thank everyone again for this amazing event. And we would like to invite Dr. Nadeau to give us some final remarks. Closing
Thank
remarks.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, 3 presentations. I found 3 things in common. Okay, among the 3, to more or less of an extent. But they're all really wonderful ones. Preservation, advocacy, engagement. All there in all 3 of them. And all, I say, unique to Fulbright. So I'll be my Fulbright pitch again. And I really feel, without elaborating on all of those, that this is what made your project special and is so inspiring to me at this juncture in time, especially. You are models of the kinds of people, the kinds of work, the kinds of activism, active scholarship that is being challenged, being denied in the U.S., and that we must fight for by doing them. So thank you so much for that. It's such a privilege and an honor to be part of your life in this small way, that we've been able to contribute to your coming here, and which you would have done anyway, and you would have done this work anyway. So I just feel like it's really a privilege for us. Like I said in my speech the other night, I wanted to thank the staff, but also want to thank you from us for doing this incredible work. I mean, I loved all 3 presentations. I'm sure all of us did. And by the way, we had an online audience for the talks this afternoon, brought to you by Project Tyra. Project Tyra is a consortium of Taiwan graduate students abroad who do kind of free mentorship for Taiwan students here in Taiwan who are planning to go mostly to the U.S. And we've kind of teamed up with them for these presentations, and so we had an online audience for that. And then I'll just remind you, Jennifer has reminded me that June 17th will be our 3rd and final round of grantee presentations. All are welcome. If it's anywhere near as stimulating as today's, I'm sure you'll want to be here. So thank you very much. Now for the presentation of certificates.